The candlelight of the private dining room flickered against the mahogany walls, but to Jintao No, the warmth felt like a funeral pyre. He sat at the head of the table, his charcoal suit tailored to hide the scars of a dozen street wars, while the heavy silver luxury watch on his wrist felt like a shackle he had forged himself. Every tick of the gears was a reminder of the syndicate's weight, power, blood, and a legacy built on bones. Across from him, his lieutenants laughed over expensive cognac. Their voices a dull roar that meant everything to the underworld, yet nothing to his hollow chest. Stay till the end and watch how the secrets unfold. The rain in Seoul didn't wash things clean. It only turned the city's grit into a dark, slick sludge. Jintao No sat in the back of his black sedan, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum that mirrored the restlessness in his chest. His hand traced the ink on his neck, a habit he only fell into when he was haunted. He was supposed to be at a victory gala, toasted by men who feared him, but instead he was parked at the edge of a crumbling district where the streetlights flickered like dying breaths. "This is the place, boss," his driver, Min, said, quietly, looking at the GPS. Jintao looked out the window. The apartment building was a concrete scar against the skyline, draped in tangled power lines and rusted fire escapes. It was a world away from the velvet-lined VIP room where he had first seen her. He stepped out, his handmade Italian shoes crunching on broken glass. He didn't need an umbrella. The cold rain felt honest compared to the suffocating luxury of his life. In the dim, yellow-lit hallway of the third floor, he found her. Russell wasn't wearing her crisp server's vest anymore. She was in a faded hoodie, her shoulders braced against a door that looked like it had been kicked one too many times. 3 men stood over her, low-level street muscle. The kind of gnats Jintao usually swatted without looking. They were laughing, a jagged, ugly sound. One of them reached out, his hand wrapping around Russell's throat. "Your husband's debts didn't die with him, Russell," the lead thug sneered. "If you can't pay in one, maybe that pretty daughter of yours has something we can sell." Jintao's world tilted. He saw Russell's eyes, not filled with the professional mask she wore at the restaurant, but a raw, jagged terror she was trying to hide from the child behind the door. "Let her go." Jintao's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hallway like a razor. The thugs turned, their bravado flickering as they took in the man standing in the shadows. They saw the charcoal suit, the silver watch, and then the tattoos. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They weren't looking at a concerned citizen. They were looking at the king of the Seoul underworld. "Boss, no, we didn't know. We were just—" "I didn't ask for your life story," Jintao said, stepping into the light. He didn't move fast, but the air in the hallway seemed to vanish. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of high-denomination bills, and dropped them into the puddle at the lead thug's feet. "Take it. If I see your faces on this block again, I won't use money next time. I'll use a shovel." They scrambled, snatching the wet cash and disappearing down the stairs. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Russell leaned against the doorframe, her breath hitching. She looked at Jintao, this dangerous, beautiful monster who had just bought her safety, and her hands trembled. "Why are you here?" she whispered. Jintao didn't answer. His gaze shifted to the small gap in the doorway. There, peering out with wide, silent eyes, was Maya. The little girl didn't look at the thugs or the money. She looked straight at Jintao. Slowly, she raised her hand to her chin and moved it forward, the sign for thank you. Jintao felt a phantom pain in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd worn for 20 years. He didn't sign back. He couldn't. Not yet. "You owe me nothing," Jintao said, his voice turning back to stone as he turned to leave. "But the world is small, Russell, and I don't like leaving debts unpaid." In the days that followed, a strange, sterile quiet settled over the block. The shadows that usually lingered in the alleyways, the dealers, the debt collectors, and the predatory loiterers vanished as if scrubbed away by an invisible hand. Russell noticed the change the moment she stepped onto the sidewalk to head to her shift. The cracked pavement had been swept, and the flickering street lamp that had been dead for months was suddenly glowing with a steady white light. A black SUV sat at the end of the street, its tinted windows impenetrable, watching like a gargoyle. She knew it wasn't the city council finally doing their job. It was Jintao's brand of mercy. By the time she returned home that evening, the transformation was even more jarring. The graffiti that had scarred the brickwork of her building was gone, replaced by fresh paint that didn't quite match but felt like a shield. As she fumbled for her keys, the heavy door was opened from the inside by a man in a sharp black suit. He didn't speak, he simply bowed slightly and stepped aside, his hand resting near his hip in a way that made Russell's stomach do a slow, sick roll. This wasn't safety, it was an occupation. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered to the empty hallway, her voice trembling. The following morning, Jintao appeared. He didn't knock, he simply waited in the corridor as she was leaving to take Maya to her therapy session. He looked immaculate, his dark suit contrasting sharply with the peeling wallpaper of the tenement. But as he stepped into a patch of morning light, the tattoos on his neck and hands seemed to pulse with a life of their own. To the world, they were symbols of a king. To Russell, they were a road map of every life he had broken to get where he was. Maya saw him first. Her face lit up, her small hands immediately flying into a sequence of signs, asking if he was the strong man from the restaurant. Jintao's expression softened for a fraction of a second, his gaze lingering on the girl's hands, but he remained still. "The neighborhood is secure," Jintao said, his voice low and resonant. "You won't be bothered again." Russell pulled Maya closer, her grip on the girl's hand tightening until her knuckles were ashu. "You think because you paid off some thugs and painted a wall, I'm supposed to feel grateful? I see what you are, Mr. No. I see the ink. I see the men downstairs with guns under their jackets." She stepped toward him, her fear manifesting as a sharp, defensive anger. "My daughter lives in a world of silence, but she isn't blind. I don't want your blood-soaked protection. I want you to stay away from us." Jintao didn't flinch. He stood like a statue, his dark eyes absorbing her fury without judgment. He looked at the girl, then back to the mother, the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets pressing against his lips. He had spent his life being feared, but seeing that fear in Russell's eyes felt like a sentence he wasn't ready to serve. Without a word, he stepped back, allowing them to pass, a silent ghost in a world he was trying and failing to claim as his own. The iron-scented smell of gunpowder and the screech of tires still hung in the humid night air as Jintao's sedan tore through the city gates. The second attempt had been less a warning and more a slaughterhouse invitation. A black van had tried to ram Russell's meager apartment entrance while she and Maya were inside. If it hadn't been for Jintao's sentries, the building would have become a tomb. Now as the car wound up the private, tree-lined drive of Jintao's mountain estate, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the sirens they had left behind. Russell sat in the back seat, her body vibrating with a cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated fury. She held Maya so tightly that the girl shifted uncomfortably, her wide eyes fixed on the blurring silhouette of the high stone walls and the security cameras that tracked their every move. The car came to a halt in front of a sprawling, traditional Hanok-style guest house, separated from the main mansion by a manicured rock garden and a dark, koi-filled pond. "Out," Jintao said. His voice was like a low-frequency hum, devoid of emotion, but heavy with a command that brooked no argument. He stood by the open door, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the moonlit estate. Russell stepped out, her legs nearly giving way. She looked at the guest house, a masterpiece of wood and glass, and then at Jintao. "This isn't protection," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper so Maya wouldn't hear. "This is a cage. You're moving us from one target to another." Jintao didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the perimeter, his eyes reflecting the cold security lights. In your apartment, you were a target in a cardboard box. Here, you are behind 6 inches of reinforced steel and 20 armed men. You stay here for observation. My observation. And if I refuse? Jintao finally turned, the ink on his neck seeming to darken in the shadows. Then you die in the street, and I spend the rest of my life wondering why I let it happen. I don't like wondering, Russell. Maya, sensing the vibration of the tension, tugged on Jintao's sleeve. She raised her hands, her movements small and hesitant. "Is this your home?" She signed. Jintao's jaw tightened. The monster who ran the soul streets looked down at the innocent girl, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes flickered. He didn't sign back, the words felt too heavy for his scarred hands, but he gave a single, stiff nod. He gestured toward the open door of the guest house where a maid stood waiting with fresh linens and a tray of food. "Everything you need is inside," he said, turning his back on them. "Do not attempt to leave the grounds. My men have orders to keep you safe, even from yourselves." As he walked away toward the main house, his shadow stretching long and dark across the gravel, Russell felt the weight of the silver-tongued devil's hospitality. She was safe, but as the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, she realized she had traded one kind of terror for a much more beautiful and far more dangerous kind of prisoner's life. The golden silence of the estate was broken the next afternoon by a sound Jintao hadn't prepared for, the rhythmic, frustrated sobbing of a child. He was standing on the veranda of the main house, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, when he saw Maya sitting on the edge of the stone path that led to the koi pond. 2 of his best sentries stood a few feet away, tall and immovable as statues. They were trained to take a bullet without flinching, but as the little girl gestured frantically toward them, her hands moving in a blur of desperate motion, the men looked utterly helpless. They didn't understand her, and their stony silence was terrifying her. Jintao set his glass down on the railing. He descended the stairs with a predatory grace that usually made men move out of his way, but as he approached the girl, his footsteps slowed. Maya's face was flushed, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She was signing over and over, a sequence of movements that spoke of a lost toy, a fallen doll that had tumbled into the deep, dark water of the pond. To the guards, she was just a ghost making shapes in the air. To Jintao, she was a mirror of a memory he had spent 15 years trying to bury. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her small frame. The guards straightened, their eyes fixed forward, but Jintao waved them away with a sharp, impatient flick of his tattooed wrist. He knelt in the gravel, heedless of the dirt staining his custom trousers. Maya looked up, her breath hitching in a jagged sob. For a long moment, Jintao simply looked at her, the ink on his neck feeling like a brand of shame. Then slowly he raised his hands. His fingers were scarred from old fights, his knuckles thick. but as he moved them, the motions were fluid and precise. "Don't cry," he signed, "the movement's soft and steady. I will find it for you." The change in Maya was instantaneous. The crying stopped, her eyes widening until they were like dark saucers. The shock of being understood by the scary man held her breathless. Jintao reached into the shallow edge of the pond, his silver watch dipping into the water as he retrieved a small, waterlogged ragdoll. He handed it to her, his expression unreadable. Maya took the doll, but her gaze remained on Jintao's hands. "You know the quiet words," she signed, her tiny fingers moving with tentative hope. Jintao felt a sharp, crystalline crack in the center of his chest. It was a sensation more painful than any wound he'd ever received. He thought of his sister, the one who had lived in that same silence, and the promise he'd broken to stay by her side. "I know them," he signed back, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I haven't forgotten." In that moment, the ice that had encased Jintao's heart for 2 decades didn't just melt. It shattered. He realized that while he had brought this family here to protect them from his enemies, it was he who was being rescued from himself. He was no longer just a boss or a killer. He was a bridge to a world Maya thought she had to navigate alone. From the porch of the guest house, he felt Russell's gaze on them, wary, stunned, and for the first time softening. He didn't look back. He stayed in the dirt with the girl, learning a new way to speak. The stillness of the estate was a lie, and Park knew it. Standing in the shadows of the main villa's corridor, the underboss watched through a window as Jintao sat on a stone bench in the garden. There was no ledger in Jintao's lap, no burner phone pressed to his ear. Instead, his hands were moving in the air, tracing silent, rhythmic patterns for the little girl who sat cross-legged at his feet. To Park, those hands, the same hands that had strangled a rival in a Busan shipyard 3 years ago, now looked weak. They looked civilian. A cigarette burned unheeded in Park's fingers. He had served the No family for 2 decades, thriving on the cold, predictable brutality of their reign. But the man in the garden was becoming unpredictable. Jintao had skipped the last 3 council meetings, and rumors were already trickling down to the docks that the King of Seoul was being tamed by a waitress and a child who couldn't even speak. "He looks happy," a voice murmured behind him. It was Captain O, a man whose loyalty was as sharp as the switchblade he kept in his sleeve. "Happiness is a luxury for men who don't have targets on their backs," Park spat, finally taking a drag of his cigarette. He turned away from the window, his eyes narrowing. A happy boss is a distracted boss, and a distracted boss gets us all killed. Look at him, oh, he's learning to play house while the Guan Yu Syndicate is encroaching on our northern territories. He's soft. The ink hasn't changed, but the blood underneath it has turned to water. Later that night, in a smoke-filled basement bar far from the mountain estate, Park sat with the 4 primary captains of the syndicate. He didn't speak of betrayal, not yet. Instead, he spoke of stability. He reminded them of the golden rule of their world. The organization survives because the head is focused on the body. "Our accounts are being frozen to pay for private security for a guest house," Park whispered, leaning over a table cluttered with whiskey glasses. "He's bringing outsiders into the inner circle. Witnesses, a woman who knows too much and a girl who sees everything. If the police come knocking, do you think he'll choose the family, or will he choose the girl?" The captains exchanged uneasy glances. The seeds were planted. Park watched the flicker of doubt in their eyes, a slow-growing rot he had carefully initiated. He wasn't just planning a mutiny. He was justifying a necessity. As he left the bar, the cold Seoul air felt like a promise. Jintao might have found his heart, but in this world, a heart was just a place to aim a bullet. He would wait for the right moment to strike, ensuring that when the crown fell, he would be the one standing there to catch it. The transformation of Jintao happened in the quiet spaces between the city's roar. While Park gathered shadows in basement bars, Jintao spent his mornings making phone calls that had nothing to do with territory and everything to do with a specialized academy for the deaf. He moved millions of won through shell companies, not to launder profit, but to ensure that the Seoul Institute of Silent Arts would never have to turn away a child like Maya again. He did it anonymously, a ghost donor providing a future he had once denied his own flesh and blood. The evening of the spring showcase arrived with a soft, persistent breeze. Jintao didn't arrive in his usual motorcade. He came alone, driving a nondescript SUV, his tattoos hidden beneath the high collar of a dark cashmere coat. He slipped into the back of the darkened auditorium just as the lights dimmed, finding Russell in the third row. She looked back and saw him, a silhouette of danger in a room full of parents. And for the first time she didn't look away in fear. She simply moved her bag, leaving the seat beside her empty. When Maya finally stepped onto the stage, the world outside the theater ceased to exist. The performance was a rhythmic dance, the children moving in perfect synchrony to the vibrations of the heavy bass pulsing through the floorboards. Maya was center stage, her movements a fluid, expressive story of a bird finding its wings. She was radiant, her face lit by a joy that was untainted by the violence Jintao represented. As Jintao watched her, he felt a strange, terrifying sensation. He felt light. For 20 years, his value had been measured in the fear he inspired and the blood he was willing to spill. But here, in a room where sound was secondary and the heart spoke through motion, he was just a man watching a girl thrive. He saw the parents around him, men with calloused hands and tired eyes who lived for their children's smiles, and realized he wanted to be one of them. He wanted a life where the only thing he protected was this fragile, beautiful peace. When the performance ended and the auditorium erupted in silent applause, hundreds of hands waving in the air, Maya scanned the crowd. Her eyes found Jintao in the back row. She didn't hesitate. She raised her hands and signed, "I did it for you." Jintao didn't care who was watching or what his enemies would say about his softness. He raised his own scarred hands and signed back, "You were perfect." Russell reached out, her fingers grazing Jintao's sleeve, acknowledging the man beneath the monster. In that moment, Jintao saw a world outside of the syndicate. A world of colors, music he could feel, and a family that didn't require a body count to keep. It was a beautiful dream, but as he felt the heavy weight of his burner phone vibrating in his pocket, he knew the nightmare was far from over. The following afternoon, a heavy silence permeated the main villa while Jintao was away dealing with business that Russell now understood to be the dismantling of his old life. Boredom and a lingering curiosity led her into the West Wing, a part of the house the maids avoided. In a dusty, sun-drenched office that smelled of cedar and old paper, she found a lacquered box tucked behind a row of leather-bound ledgers. It wasn't filled with ledgers of debt or hit lists, but with the fragile remains of a life lived before the ink. Russell sat on the floor, her breath hitching as she pulled out a stack of yellowed photographs. In them, a teenage Jintao, his skin smooth, his neck free of the jagged black dragons that now defined him, stood with his arm around a small girl. The girl had the same bright, inquisitive eyes as Maya, but her hands were frozen in a familiar gesture in every shot. She was signing. In one photo, they were sitting by a river. Jintao was laughing, his face open and vulnerable, a version of the man Russell hadn't known existed. Beneath the photos was a hospital wristband and a series of letters written in a shaky, youthful hand. Russell couldn't read the Korean script, but she recognized the drawings in the margins, small hands forming the signs for love, brother, and forever. As she pieced together the dates, the realization hit her like a physical blow. Jintao hadn't just learned sign language to be kind to Maya, he had lived it. He had been the primary protector of a sister who had inhabited the same silent world. She found a final clipping from a newspaper 15 years old, a report of a syndicate fire that had claimed the life of a young girl. The report mentioned a brother who had tried to run back into the flames, held back by the very men who would eventually become his subordinates. Her name was Maylin, a voice rasped from the doorway. Russell jumped, dropping the photos as Jintao stepped into the room. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, the dragon on his neck appearing like a shackle in the dying light. He didn't look angry that she had trespassed. He looked hollowed out. "I promised her I would be her voice," he said, his gaze fixed on the photo of the laughing boy by the river. "But I chose power instead. I thought if I became the monster, I could protect her from the other monsters." "I was wrong." Russell looked at the photos spread across the floor, then back at the man standing before her. The monster was still there, the scars and the history wouldn't vanish. But for the first time she saw the mourning boy beneath the ink. She didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw a man who had been grieving in silence for 15 years, using Maya as a way to finally keep a promise he had failed to keep for his sister. She stood up and walked toward him, not out of fear, but out of a shared understanding of loss. She reached out and placed a hand on his tattooed wrist. "You aren't just the monster, Jintao," she whispered. "The man who loved Maylin is still in there. Maya sees him every day." The following week, the air on the estate turned cold, thick with the scent of an approaching storm. Jintao sat in his office, the heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that sounded like a countdown. On his desk lay 2 folders. One contained the coordinates for a massive heroin shipment moving through the Incheon docks. A deal worth enough to cement Park's loyalty and silence the grumbling captains for a decade. The other was a summons from a family court, a legal ambush set by Russell's former in-laws who were using her association with a known criminal to sue for emergency custody of Maya. Park stood by the window, his eyes gleaming with the predatory light of a man who thought he had finally won. "The ships are in the harbor, Jintao. The captains are waiting at the pier. If you aren't there to personally oversee the exchange, the Guan Yu Syndicate will take it as an invitation to war. This is the moment to show them the king is back." Jintao didn't look at the dock coordinates. His gaze was fixed on a small, crayon-drawn picture of a koi fish that Maya had left on his desk that morning. He knew the math of his world. If he went to the docks, he secured his throne but lost the girl. If he went to the court, he would be admitting on a public record that he was protecting them, effectively painting a bullseye on all their backs while handing Park the perfect excuse for a coup. "The docks can wait," Jintao said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Park turned, his face contorting with disbelief. "Wait, Jintao, that shipment is 40 billion won. The captains are already on the edge. If you choose that woman's legal drama over the family business, you aren't just being soft, you're being suicidal." "Then I'll be a dead man with a clear conscience," Jintao replied, standing up. He grabbed the custody folder and walked toward the door, his dark coat billowing like a shroud. "Tell the captains to go home. There will be no exchange tonight." He arrived at the courthouse just as Russell was being led into a side room, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed with terror. When she saw Jintao, the ink on his neck visible above his silk tie, his presence radiating a power that made the bailiffs step back. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. Jintao didn't offer a platitude. He simply walked to the front of the room, flanked by the city's most expensive defense attorneys, and placed his hand on the table. For 3 hours he sat in the cold light of the courtroom, exposing himself to the scrutiny of the law, testifying to his philanthropic ties to Russell's family while his phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket with frantic messages from the docks. He watched Maya through the glass partition, the girl signing stay with trembling fingers. He stayed. By the time the judge ruled in Russell's favor, citing the unprecedented security and support provided by Jintao's estate, the heroin shipment was already at the bottom of the harbor, seized by a police tip-off that Park had leaked in retaliation. Jintao had saved the girl, but as he walked Russell and Maya back to the car, the look on his face told her the truth. He had just paid for their safety with his crown. The betrayal tasted like copper and cold mountain air. Jintao was just pulling into the driveway of the Institute, his mind still lingering on the quiet triumph of the courtroom, when his primary burner phone screamed to life. It wasn't the rhythmic vibration of a business call. It was the frantic, staccato pulse of a distress signal from the estate's guest house. Before he could even press the device to his ear, the signal went dead. At the mountain estate, the peace had been shattered by a precision only a brother-in-arms could execute. Park hadn't used explosives. He had used the very security codes Jintao had trusted him with for a decade. The sentries at the gate, men who had sworn blood oaths to the No family, didn't even draw their weapons before they were neutralized by Park's loyalist captains. Russell had been in the kitchen of the guest house helping Maya pack her bag for the next day of school when the heavy oak door was kicked inward. She didn't scream. She lunged for the knife on the counter, but she was met by the cold, unyielding barrel of a suppressed pistol. Park stepped into the room, his face illuminated by the flickering security monitors he had just compromised. He looked at Russell with a clinical sort of pity, then turned his gaze to Maya, who stood frozen, her hands halfway through the sign for friend. "You were the beginning of the end, Russell," Park said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. Jintao traded 40 billion won for a few hours in a courtroom. He broke the family. Now, the family has to fix him. Maya didn't understand the words, but she felt the vibration of the heavy boots and the jagged, dark energy radiating from the men in suits. She reached out for her mother, but Park's second-in-command stepped between them. He didn't treat her with the reverence Jintao did. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising her small frame. Russell fought like a wounded lioness, her screams echoing through the valley, but she was pinned against the wall as she watched her daughter being carried toward a waiting black van. By the time Jintao's SUV roared back through the estate gates, the coup was complete. The grounds were eerily silent, the koi pond still and dark under the moon. He found Russell on the floor of the guest house, her clothes torn and her spirit shattered. She didn't have to say a word. She simply raised her hands and signed the one word that destroyed Jintao's world. Gone. Jintao stood in the center of the room, his charcoal suit stained with the dust of the courtroom, looking at the empty space where Maya had been. The ink on his neck felt like a tightening noose. Park had left a single burner phone on the kitchen island. It buzzed once. A text message appeared. Cold and final. The crown for the girl. Midnight at the shipyard. Come alone or she stays in the silence forever. The shipyard was a skeletal graveyard of rusted steel and salt-cracked concrete, but to Jintao it was the only place where he truly made sense. He didn't come with an army. He came as the ghost of Seoul, the version of himself he had tried to bury in the garden with Maya. He had shed his luxury watch and his charcoal suit, dressed now in tactical black, his movements as silent as the world Maya lived in. Park's men were stationed every 50 yards, their breath visible in the freezing midnight air, but they were looking for a man, not a shadow. Jintao moved through the rafters of the main warehouse with a lethal, predatory grace. He didn't use a gun. A gunshot was too loud, too merciful. Instead, he used the darkness and a length of piano wire, neutralizing the perimeter guards one by one. Each time a body hit the floor, Jintao felt the old, cold numbness trying to reclaim him. But the memory of Maya's small hands signing thank you acted as his anchor. By the time he reached the central office, Park's operation was hemorrhaging. The radio chatter was a frantic mess of static and fear. "He's in the walls," one captain screamed before the line went dead. Jintao wasn't just killing, he was dismantling their psyche. He cut the power to the entire pier, plunging the shipyard into a void where only he knew how to navigate. In the pitch black, he was no longer a man who had lost his crown. He was the monster that the syndicate used to tell stories about to keep their initiates in line. He intercepted the shipment of illegal weapons Park had planned to use to solidify his coup, rigging the crates with thermite. As the warehouse erupted in a silent, white-hot bloom of fire, Jintao stepped through the smoke, his face smudged with soot and blood that wasn't his own. He looked like a demon rising from the wreckage of his own empire. He found the third in command, the man who had bruised Maya's arm, cowering behind a shipping container. Jintao didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for information. He simply moved with a speed that defied his age, his hands, the same hands that had gently retrieved a rag doll from a pond, now becoming instruments of absolute terror. He left the man alive but broken, a message to Park that the king hadn't grown soft. He had simply found something worth killing for. As the shipyard burned behind him, Jintao stood on the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed on the final warehouse where he knew Park was waiting with the girl. He had destroyed the operation, the money, and the loyalty of the captains in a single night. He had stripped himself of everything except the ink on his skin and the rage in his heart. The ghost of soul had returned, and as he walked toward the final confrontation, the only thing he cared about was that Maya would never have to see the man he had become tonight. The interior of the final warehouse smelled of salt, rust, and the metallic tang of impending violence. High above, a single industrial bulb flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the concrete floor. Park stood in the center of the vast space, his hand resting heavily on Maya's shoulder. The girl was pale, her small frame trembling, but her eyes remained fixed on the darkened entrance. When Jintao stepped into the light, he looked less like a man and more like a force of nature. Bloodied, soot-stained, and radiating a quiet, terrifying stillness. "Drop the weapon, Jintao!" Park shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation that betrayed his fear. He pressed a pistol against Maya's temple. "The captains are dead, the shipyard is burning, but I still have the girl. You move, and she goes into the dark forever." Jintao stopped 30 feet away. He didn't draw his gun. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing Park his empty, scarred fingers. The gesture looked like a surrender to Park, but Jintao's eyes were locked onto Maya's. He began to move his hands, not in the frantic way of someone pleading, but with the fluid, rhythmic precision of a teacher. "Maya, look at me." His hands spoke in the silence. Park sneered, glancing at Jintao's moving fingers. "What are you doing? No more magic tricks, no more quiet words." Jintao ignored him, his focus unwavering. "When the light goes out, drop to the floor, crawl to the red door. Do not look back." Maya's breath hitched. She saw the dragon on Jintao's neck, the ink that had once terrified her mother, and she realized it wasn't a mark of a monster. It was the armor of her protector. She gave the tiniest, almost imperceptible nod. "You think you can save her with your hands?" Park laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You're a ghost, Jintao, and ghosts don't have families." Now Jintao's hands flashed a final, sharp command. In that heartbeat, Jintao's left hand reached for the small remote detonator hidden in his palm, while his right drew the suppressed pistol from the small of his back. The remaining overhead lights exploded into glass rain as he triggered the localized EMP he'd planted in the fuse box minutes earlier. The warehouse plunged into absolute pitch. Park screamed, firing blindly into the dark, the muzzle flashes illuminating nothing but empty air. Maya, true to the silent plan, had collapsed to the concrete the moment the glass shattered, scurrying toward the emergency exit marked by a dim, battery-powered red glow. Jintao moved through the darkness like he had been born in it. He didn't need sight. He tracked Park by the sound of his panicked breathing and the heavy thud of his boots. 2 shots whispered through the air, precise, clinical, and final. When the backup emergency lights hummed to life seconds later, Park was on the ground, his reign ended by the very man he thought had grown too soft to kill. Jintao didn't look at the body. He turned toward the red door where Maya stood, trembling but safe. He reached out his hand, and for the first time the silence between them felt like peace. The transition from the blood-stained shipyard to the sterile, fluorescent halls of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency felt like a descent into a different kind of purgatory. Jintao walked through the front doors, not as a suspect, but as a man making a final transaction. On the table, he placed a drive containing decades of syndicate ledgers, offshore accounts, and the names of every corrupt official who had ever fed from his hand. He didn't ask for immunity for himself. He asked for a vanishing act for Russell and Maya, a witness protection detail so ironclad that even the ghosts of the No family could never find them. The high-priced attorneys he had once used to circumvent the law now worked to dismantle his existence. As he signed the final confession, the ink on his hand seemed to pulse one last time before fading into the reality of a prison cell. He accepted the sentence with a quiet dignity that baffled his captors. He had traded his throne for a clear conscience, and for the first time in his life, the silence he lived in wasn't lonely. A year later, the world was no longer painted in the charcoal and steel of the Seoul underworld. Instead, it was the color of sea salt and morning sun. In a small coastal town where the air smelled of pine and Pacific spray, a new business had taken root. The Silent Garden. It wasn't a fortress or a front, it was a cafe and community center where the language of the hands was the only one that mattered. Jintao stood by the window of the shop, wearing a simple linen shirt that covered the dragons on his arms. He had served his shortened time, a deal struck for his cooperation in toppling the entire syndicate, and had emerged into a life that felt like a borrowed dream. He watched Russell as she moved between the tables, her laughter harmonizing with the clinking of porcelain. She was no longer a waitress hiding in the shadows of a rundown apartment. She was a woman who owned her future. Maya was in the center of the room, leading a small group of local children in a storytelling circle. Her hands moved with a joy that was infectious, her face bright with a peace that Jintao had once thought impossible. When she saw him watching, she paused and signed a single word. Father. The word vibrated through Jintao's chest, grounding him in a way the syndicate never could. He walked over to Russell, placing a hand on the small of her back. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, the fear that had once defined their meeting replaced by an easy, profound trust. They looked out at the horizon where the blue of the sea met the blue of the sky, a vast open space where no shadows could hide. The ghost of Seoul was gone, replaced by a man who had finally learned that the most powerful thing he could ever do was to simply be still.